All right, let's dive into this resilience thing. We've got some fascinating stuff on Kate Gladdin, an author and life coach from what you sent in. She really seems to understand bouncing back from tough times.
Yeah, you've actually given us quite the challenge with these. We've got this really high energy interview with her from a podcast called One's Ready. The hosts are, well, very lively, let's just say that.
Okay, I've heard of that one.
And then we've got Gladdin's own podcast, Okay, Now What? Chock full of practical advice for getting through those rough patches, you know?
So we're taking on the mission of pulling out the most valuable insights on resilience from both. We're aiming for those aha moments that make a real difference.
Great goal. And I think a good way to do that is by starting with Gladdin's own story. She had a life-changing experience when she was only 20. She lost her older sister in a really tragic accident.
Wow, that's young.
Yeah.
It's incredible how she turned that experience into a journey of understanding and teaching resilience. She even started with those, cheesy motivational quotes you see on Pinterest.
Super relatable, right? But what's interesting is how those quotes actually led her to something much deeper, the work of Viktor Frankl. He's the Holocaust survivor who wrote Man's Search for Meaning.
Oh, yeah. Powerful book.
His message about choosing your attitude in any situation, no matter what, really resonated with her, and it became like the foundation of her whole approach to resilience.
I can see why. Frankl's experience was obviously unbelievably challenging, and his message about finding meaning even in the darkest times must have been incredibly impactful for Gladdin.
Absolutely. It really speaks to the idea that even when we can't control what happens to us, we still have a choice in how we respond to it. And Gladdin really emphasizes that in her work.
So let's talk about her work then. She talks a lot about the 3 R's of resilience: recognize, reflect, and redirect.
Yeah, and she really hammers home that first step, recognizing how our own perception of events often causes us more struggle than the events themselves. It's all about understanding that we have more power than we think.
That's where she brings in that really powerful example about the driver who killed her sister, right?
Exactly. It's a tough story, but it really illustrates her point.
It must have been so difficult for her to even talk about.
She talked about how he had the power to take her sister's life, a horrific and irreversible act, but he didn't have power over how she chose to let that loss impact her own life.
Wow, that must have been an incredibly difficult realization to come to, but it also seems like it was a turning point for her in understanding the power of choice.
Exactly. It highlights how we can separate the event from our emotional reaction to it. It's not about denying the pain or minimizing the event at all, but about recognizing that we have a choice in how we let it shape us.
That's a really powerful idea. And now that we're talking about choice, I have to ask about this concept of responsibility that comes up in one of the podcasts.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
Well, I think it's a brilliant way to frame the idea of personal agency. It's your ability to choose how you respond to any situation, basically.
Sometimes it feels like we're just reacting on autopilot, though, doesn't it? Like we don't even have time to think before we're already caught up in our emotions.
Absolutely, and that's where Gladdin offers some tools for creating space between what happens and our immediate reaction. A lot of it has to do with understanding how our brains work.
Right.
Like those automatic thoughts she calls ANTs, for example.
Oh, right. The automatic negative thoughts. It's like our brains are wired for negativity sometimes.
Sometimes.
I remember in that One's Ready interview, the hosts made a joke about getting rid of your external locus of control and putting your, what's on the line.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe a little crude, but I get what they were going for. It's about taking ownership of your responses, right? It reminds me of that saying, you can't control the waves, but you can learn to surf.
Oh, I like that. So how do we learn to surf those waves of emotion? How do we actually build that responsibility?
Well, in her podcast, Gladdin provides some surprisingly simple yet powerful tools. She talks about the importance of getting outside, connecting with nature, and moving your body.
We hear that advice all the time, though. Is there something more to it than just fresh air is good for you?
Gladdin emphasizes that it's not just about feeling good in the moment, it's about actually changing your brain chemistry. She talks about how discomfort can actually be a catalyst for growth. Sometimes pushing ourselves to do the things that feel hard is exactly what we need to build resilience.
So it's not always about seeking comfort and ease, it's about understanding that growth often comes from those moments of challenge.
Exactly, and that's something I think a lot of us forget in our quest for constant happiness and comfort. Sometimes we need to lean into the discomfort to get to the other side.
Like the old saying, no pain, no gain. But I feel like Gladdin takes it a step further by explaining the science behind it, how our brains are actually wired to respond to challenge and change.
And that leads us to another important tool she offers.
Gratitude.
Gratitude. Isn't that a little cliche? I know it can sound that way, but Gladdin goes beyond simply listing things you're grateful for. She encourages you to actually relive those positive experiences in detail, almost like creating a highlight reel in your mind.
So it's not just about thinking about things you're grateful for, but about really feeling that gratitude and letting it sink in.
Exactly. And she also talks about the importance of reflecting on one good thing you did each day, no matter how small.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
It's like a reminder that even on our worst days, we still have the power to make a positive impact.
It's about recognizing your agency and reminding yourself that you're not just a passive recipient of whatever life throws at you.
I love that. But here's the thing that I keep getting stuck on. Even when we know all of this, even when we have these great tools, why is it so easy to slip back into negativity and self-pity?
That's a good question. And it really gets to the heart of why building resilience is a lifelong practice. It's not a one-time fix. Gladdin explains that part of it has to do with how our brains are wired. She talks about these biases that actually work against us, like the negativity bias, for example.
The negativity bias.
Yeah, it's this tendency our brains have to focus on threats and negative information. From an evolutionary standpoint, it makes sense. Our ancestors needed to be hyper-aware of danger to survive. But in today's world, it can mean we get stuck in a loop, just focusing on what's wrong instead of what's right.
So it's like our brains are constantly scanning for threats, even when there aren't any real threats present.
Exactly. And then there's the confirmation bias. That's where we tend to seek out information that confirms our existing beliefs, even if those beliefs are negative. It's like we're filtering out any information that contradicts our negative worldview.
That explains why it can be so hard to break out of those negative thought patterns. It's like we're actively seeking out information that reinforces them.
And it's not just our thoughts, it's our behaviors too. Gladdin brings up something called the motivational triad. Our brains are wired to seek pleasure, avoid pain, and conserve energy.
So basically, our brains are wired to take the path of least resistance, which often means staying stuck in negativity.
It's a lot easier to wallow in self-pity than it is to actively challenge those negative thoughts and beliefs. And that's why Gladdin stresses that building resilience takes conscious effort. It's about overriding those automatic tendencies and choosing a more empowering response, even when it feels difficult.
It sounds like building resilience is a lot like building a muscle. It takes consistent effort and practice, but I'm guessing the rewards are worth it.
Absolutely. And speaking of effort and practice, it might be a good place to pause. We can come back to this idea of how to actually make those changes and what the benefits might be.
That sounds like a good plan to me. This is a lot to unpack, but I feel like we're already getting to the core of what resilience is really about.
So, picking back up on this idea of resilience as a practice, one of the things Gladdin talks about that I think is so important is the difference between self-compassion and self-pity. Have you ever noticed how easy it is to get stuck in that why me cycle?
Oh, absolutely. Especially when things are feeling really tough. It's like a magnet sometimes. But if self-pity is the trap, then what does she say self-compassion looks and sounds like?
She describes self-pity as sounding like, why me? This is so unfair. While self-compassion is more like, saying to yourself, this is really hard, but I can get through this. It's about acknowledging your feelings without being swept away by them.
That's such a subtle shift, but it makes a huge difference in how you approach the problem, doesn't it? It's like you're acknowledging the struggle without letting it define you.
Exactly. And Gladdin points out 3 characteristics of self-pity that can be really helpful to recognize. She calls them the 3 Ps. Self-pity is pervasive, it's permanent, and it's personal.
So when you're in a self-pity spiral, the bad stuff feels like it's everywhere. It feels like it's never going to end, and it feels like it's all your fault.
Right. And when you can recognize those thought patterns, you can start to challenge them.
Okay, so let's say I'm feeling that pull towards self-pity. What's a practical step I can take right in that moment to shift towards self-compassion instead?
One thing that Gladdin talks about in her own life is her experience with an eating disorder in high school. She was trying to control her food intake as a way to cope with anxiety.
That's something a lot of people can probably relate to on some level, using control in one area of your life to try to manage the chaos in other areas.
Exactly. And while it might feel like a solution in the short term, those kinds of coping mechanisms often end up creating more problems in the long run.
So how did she get out of that cycle? What was her, okay, now what moment?
It was about recognizing that the eating disorder wasn't the real problem. It was a symptom of something deeper. For her, it was anxiety. And that's something I think we can all apply to our own lives.
So it's about looking beyond the surface level problem and trying to understand the root cause.
Right, because when you understand the root cause, you can start to address it in a more meaningful way. Sometimes that's about learning new coping skills. Other times, it's about shifting your perspective. And often, it's about reaching out for support.
All of this is making me think about that question you asked earlier about what choice our future selves would want us to make right now.
It's a powerful question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It forces you to step outside of that immediate situation and think about the bigger picture.
Yeah, it's like looking back on your life from the perspective of someone who's already been through it. What advice would you give your younger self?
And I think that's a key part of building resilience, making choices that are aligned with your values and your long-term goals, even when it's hard.
It's about being intentional with your life, even amidst the chaos.
That's a great way to put it, and it's something that comes up again and again in both of these podcasts. This idea of taking responsibility for your own life and creating a future that you're excited about.
I have to admit, when we started talking about those biases that make it so easy to slip back into negativity, I was feeling a little discouraged.
It can be a bit overwhelming to think about how our brains are kind of working against us in some ways.
Yeah, like we're fighting an uphill battle. But then when you start talking about the practical steps we can take, like cultivating gratitude and choosing self-compassion, it feels more hopeful.
And I think that's the beauty of Gladdin's work. It's not about pretending that life is always easy or that we should never experience negative emotions. It's about acknowledging the challenges and giving ourselves the tools to move through them in a healthy way.
It's like building that internal toolkit we were talking about earlier. The more tools we have, the better equipped we are to handle whatever life throws our way.
And the more we use those tools, the stronger they become.
So it's not just about acquiring the tools, it's about putting them into practice, even when it feels uncomfortable.
Exactly. Gladdin talks about how discomfort is the price of growth. It's a reminder that sometimes the things that feel the hardest are the things that ultimately make us stronger.
That reminds me of that analogy of the boiling water, the potato and the egg.
Right. The potato becomes soft and mushy in boiling water, while the egg becomes hard-boiled. It's all about how we choose to respond to the heat of our experiences.
So it's not about avoiding the heat altogether. It's about learning to navigate it in a way that helps us grow.
And choosing to be the egg, maybe.
Maybe not literally, but I see what you mean. It's about choosing to let those challenges make us stronger, not weaker.
Exactly. And to remember that we have more control over our responses than we often realize.
All this talk about choice is making me think back to those One's Ready podcasts, guys. They had the colorful way of talking about it.
Oh, you mean their advice about putting your, you-know-what's on the line?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the one. It's a little crude, but there's a truth to it, isn't there? It's about owning your choices and your responses.
I think it's about stepping into your power, even if it feels a little scary.
Because ultimately, playing it safe and staying in your comfort zone isn't going to lead to growth or resilience, is it?
I think Gladdin would say that growth and resilience happen when we're willing to push beyond those comfort zones and embrace the challenges that come with being alive.
And to remember that we don't have to go through those challenges alone. Both Gladdin and those guys from One's Ready talk a lot about the importance of support systems.
Absolutely, whether it's friends, family, therapists, or mentors. Having people we can rely on can make a huge difference in our ability to navigate tough times.
It's like having a safety net when you're trying something new or challenging. Knowing that you have people to catch you if you fall can make it easier to take those risks.
And to celebrate the wins along the way. Because even the smallest steps forward deserve to be acknowledged.
That's so important. It's easy to get caught up in the what's next and forget to celebrate how far we've already come.
And celebrating those wins, no matter how small, helps build momentum and confidence. It's like giving yourself a pat on the back and saying, hey, you're doing great.
It's like fuel for the resilience engine.
I love that analogy.
Well, I'm feeling pretty fueled up right now. This conversation has been so insightful. I'm curious, what's standing out to you as we wrap up this part of our dive into resilience?
For me, it's this combination of understanding those deep-rooted biases that we're up against with these very practical tools that we can implement every day. That and the reminder that it's not about being perfect, it's about progress. And it's about self-compassion along the way. What about you? What's resonating most with you?
I think what's resonating with me most is that this idea of resilience being a practice
Right.
really takes the pressure off. It's not about achieving some kind of perfect state of unbreakability.
It's more about building that muscle, right? Knowing that there will be times when we stumble, we fall, but we can always get back up.
It's like that image of a phoenix rising from the ashes. There's something so powerful about that idea of transformation and renewal.
And I think both of the podcasts we're looking at today really speak to that idea of transformation. They both offer these practical tools and insights that can help us to literally rewire our brains for resilience.
That's a great point. We've been talking about these concepts, but it's amazing to think that they can actually change our neurobiology.
It really shows that we're not stuck with the brains we were born with. We have the power to change and adapt, even on a physiological level.
It makes me think about that tool that Gladdin talks about, recognizing those ANTs, those automatic negative thoughts. Just becoming aware of them feels like a huge step.
It's like shining a light on those thought patterns that we often don't even realize are running in the background. And once we see them, we can start to question them.
Because those thoughts aren't always true, right? It's like they're telling us a story, but we don't have to believe every story we hear.
Right. We have the power to choose which stories we want to buy into and which stories we want to rewrite.
It's almost like we're the directors of our own mental movies. We can choose which scenes we want to focus on and which scenes we want to edit out.
And the more we practice directing those mental movies, the more skilled we become at creating a more positive and empowering narrative for ourselves.
That whole idea of taking control of our narratives brings me back to that analogy of the boiling water, the potato, and the egg.
It's such a simple analogy, but it really gets to the heart of what resilience is all about, doesn't it?
It's not about avoiding the heat, it's about choosing how we respond to it.
And maybe even choosing to be the egg sometimes, to allow ourselves to be transformed by those challenges instead of being softened by them.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we always have a choice, even when it feels like we don't. And it's in those moments of choice that resilience is forged.
It's about owning that power to choose and remembering that even the smallest choices can have a ripple effect on our lives.
That's a great reminder. So as we wrap up this deep dive into resilience, what's the one takeaway you hope our listener walks away with?
I hope they walk away with a sense of hope and empowerment, knowing that resilience is a skill that can be learned and cultivated, and that they have all the tools they need to create a life that feels meaningful and fulfilling, even amidst the inevitable challenges.
Beautifully said. And to our listener, we want to leave you with this one final thought. What seeds of resilience are you going to plant today? What small choice can you make right now that will move you in the direction of a stronger, more resilient you? We're excited to see what you grow. I think what's resonating most with me is this idea of resilience being a practice. It really takes the pressure off, It's not about reaching some perfect state of unbreakability.
Yeah, it's more about building that muscle, right? Like, we know there will be times we stumble and fall, but we can always get back up.
It's like that image of the phoenix rising from the ashes. There's something so powerful about that idea of transformation, renewal.
And I think both of these podcasts we're looking at really speak to that idea of transformation. They both offer practical tools and insights that can help us to literally rewire our brains for resilience.
That's a great point. We've been talking about these concepts, but it's amazing to think they can actually change our neurobiology, like physically.
Yeah, it really shows that we're not stuck with the brains we were born with. We have the power to change and adapt, even on a physiological level.
It makes me think about that tool Gladdin talks about, recognizing those ANTs, those automatic negative thoughts. Just becoming aware of them feels like a huge step.
It's like shining a light on those thought patterns that we often don't even realize are running in the background. Once we see them, then we can start to question them.
Because those thoughts aren't always true, are they? It's like they're telling us a story, but we don't have to believe every story we hear.
Exactly. We have the power to choose which stories we buy into and which stories we want to rewrite.
It's almost like we're the directors of our own mental movies. We can choose which scenes we focus on, which scenes we edit out.
And the more we practice directing those mental movies, the more skilled we become at creating a more positive and empowering narrative for ourselves.
That whole idea of taking control of our narratives brings me back to that analogy of the boiling water, the potato, and the egg.
It's such a simple analogy, but it really gets to the heart of resilience, doesn't it?
It's not about avoiding the heat. It's about choosing how we respond to it.
And maybe even choosing to be the egg sometimes, to allow those challenges to transform us instead of soften us.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we always have a choice, even when it feels like we don't. And it's in those moments of choice that resilience is forged.
It's about owning that power to choose and remembering that even the smallest choices can have a ripple effect.
That's a great reminder. So as we wrap up this deep dive into resilience, what's the one takeaway you hope our listener walks away with?
I hope they walk away feeling hopeful, empowered, knowing that resilience is a skill, that it can be learned and cultivated, and that they already have the tools they need to create a life that feels meaningful, fulfilling, even amidst the challenges.
Beautifully said. And to our listener, we want to leave you with one final thought. What seeds of resilience are you going to plant today? What small choice can you make right now that will move you toward a stronger, more resilient you? We're excited to see what you grow.